The Tree in the Forest by Terry Greenhough. Originally published in the February 1974 issue of Science Fiction Monthly, republished in the Best of Science Fiction Monthly in 1975, and then again in the French Science Fiction magazine number 1 in November 1976. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Tree in the Forest. There was no path. Harding picked his way cautiously through the trees, holding the gun tightly. "All clear so far," he whispered into the radio. "Okay, keep looking." "No choice, have I?" His voice was sharp with nervousness. 3 men are gone, maybe dead. I don't want to be the 4th. "You won't be," somebody back at the ship promised. Harding wished he could feel so sure. He glanced down, fighting off a shudder of disgust. The bouncer was still with him, a foot or so in front, matching his speed exactly. The urge to kill it there and then was almost too strong for him, but somehow he resisted it. The bouncer was a flattened spheroid, about 10 inches high, colored a pale, sickly yellow. Its flesh appeared soft, pulpy, and horrible, a crisscross of veins showing just beneath its skin. The only visible external feature was a small eye fringe near the top. It had no legs and progressed by a series of short hops or bounces. It was leading Harding into the wood, which worried him. Each of the 3 missing men had followed bouncers. None of them had returned. After the first few descriptions of the situation, all that had flashed over the air had been one brief, cryptic message from the second man. Then, total silence. "It's still here," Harding said, "guiding me, or setting me up. I'm heading in the direction of McKay's last radio call." He heard a loud noise in the undergrowth and whirled round quickly. It turned out to be a false alarm. He grimaced and went on. Experimentally, he made a grab at the bouncer. It hopped out of reach, too swift for him. It was always the same. They wouldn't let anybody touch them. Intelligent, he decided. But how intelligent? Enough to lure 3 men to... He tried not to think. The bouncer slowed until it was roughly a foot ahead of him again. He didn't bother with a second attempt at catching it. He wouldn't have succeeded. A tiny insect droned past his head, only the 4th or 5th he'd seen, he realized. And he hadn't noticed even a single bird. That was strange in a wood as flourishing as this. Plenty of animals, yet no birds and few insects. Not that it mattered, he thought, and pressed on. He continued without anything unusual occurring for several minutes. He started to breathe more evenly. Suddenly, the bouncer left him. Without any warning, it began to hop faster. It drew steadily away from him, a yard in front, 2 yards, 3, 4. And then it disappeared into the undergrowth in front of him. His fingers tightened on the gun. His heart started to hammer. Straining his eyes, he tried to catch a glimpse of the bouncer, but all he could see was a vague movement in the undergrowth. He seemed to be alone. He whispered into the radio mouthpiece, "It's gone. The bouncer's gone. It's a yard or so in front of me, but I don't know exactly where. God, it's creepy in these woods." "Keep talking," urged the radio. "This is just how it happened with... well, you know what I mean." "I know what you mean." His voice was heavy. "The thing's still in front of me. I can see the grass moving. Christ, I'm jumpy. The trees seem to be thinning out." "This is it." The radio man's voice was high with excitement. "First the bouncer leaves you, then the trees thin out, and then... Sorry." "So am I," said Harding with feeling. His finger was trembling on the trigger. This was the moment of truth. This was how it had happened with the other three men. First, the bouncer had hopped away from them, and then they'd noticed a thinning out in the trees. After that, they'd told of a clearing at a tree, and that was all. Silence. All except for that one mysterious radio message. Harding took 4 more steps forward and saw that the trees were becoming more and more scarce. The leafage was less dense, so that he could see several yards in front. He took another 6 steps until he was out in the open, and then he stopped dead in amazement. He was standing in a clearing, and in front of him stood a tree. The clearing had a grass-covered floor, with here and there some colorful forest flower reaching skywards. Harding estimated that the clearing was at least 50 yards in diameter, and most of it was taken up by the tree. It was one of the largest trees he'd ever seen, and certainly the weirdest. He could see no trunk, for the leaves were too thick and the branches hung low. The ends of the lower branches met the ground, forming a great green canopy over most of the clearing. Harding couldn't see through the outer leaves, and he could only guess at the girth of the central trunk. He estimated that its size must be colossal to support such a weight of branches. The leaves were huge and oval, and Harding guessed that each one was at least the length of his arm. He continued to stare at the tree for some time, speechless and surprised. The radio still chattered at him, but he didn't notice it. His mind was too much occupied with the tree. One of the branches of the tree was no more than 5 yards away from him, and his whole attention slowly came to bear on this nearest branch. He gazed at it in a kind of dazed fascination, for it made no sense. Hanging in an orderly line from the branch were no fewer than 20 bouncers. They were hanging upside down, with their eye fringes towards the ground. Harding thought they were asleep. He also thought they looked like a row of pale, fleshy fruits hanging from the branch. Briefly, he wondered if the bouncers might in fact be vegetable rather than animal organisms, but he soon dismissed the thought as being ridiculous. He noticed something he hadn't seen before. There was another mark on the bouncers, just below the eye fringe. This was a circular patch of dark coloration whose function escaped him. He stood there for a while before regaining his senses. Then, slowly, he turned his mind to the radio. "Hello," he said at last, hearing the sigh of relief from the other end. "Sorry about the pause. I was surprised. I'm in a clearing, just like the others were. I can see that huge tree they described. There's a row of... Wait a minute. This is something new." His voice was sharp and excited. A flash of movement caught his eye some 30 yards away, around the edge of the clearing. He looked, blinked, then looked again, and still he was unsure whether his eyes were right. Only a stone's throw away from him, a solitary bouncer was hopping steadily through the grass towards the tree. Behind it trailed a small quadruped, which the survey group had spotted in great numbers. The animal was following obediently where the bouncer led, exactly as Harding himself had done. Exactly as the 3 missing men had done. His grip relaxed on the gun, and he tried to prepare himself for trouble. While he watched, the bouncer led its victim right into the heart of the tree, completely out of sight. He reported the sighting to the ship. "The bouncer and the animal have both gone into the middle of the tree. Everything's quiet. There's nothing... Good God!" Once again his voice lifted almost to a scream. "This is ridiculous! There are 2 more of them. Another bouncer and another quadruped. They're coming out of the tree, not in. It doesn't make sense. I don't think it's the same pair. They're heading for the wood. They're going into the trees. They've gone." He shook his head in disbelief. First a bouncer leading a victim into the depths of the tree, and then another bouncer leading another victim out into the woods. He shook his head again. Then his mouth began to feel dry, and total fear overcame him. For this moment, he knew, might be one of the last in his life. This was the moment at which he had to take his search right into the heart of the mysterious tree. There was no turning back, and the only way to go was forward, forward into the very depths of the alien tree, into which, presumably, 3 of his colleagues had already ventured, never to return. It was a chilling prospect. I'm going in, he said hesitantly into the radio. As he walked towards the tree, he wondered what he might find within the cover of its monstrous branches. Death, perhaps? Probably the bodies of his colleagues. Or were they by some chance still alive? He didn't know. He couldn't guess. The only way to find out was to enter the tangle of branches and investigate the tree. He parted the foliage carefully and ducked under, and then the branches closed behind him and the outer world disappeared. He was alone in the mystery world beneath the tree. Hardly any sunlight filtered through. A dim twilight held sway over the scene, with the result that the shadows seemed to stretch and move and reach for Harding with long and ghostly fingers. He was afraid. There was not one central trunk, but at least 20 small ones, and Harding now learned that the tree mass was indeed a collection of average-sized trees which had grouped together as if for company, finally growing into one vast conglomeration which had spread until it almost filled the clearing. Or had it? No, the thought was crazy. Had it perhaps actually made the clearing for itself, pushing back all the other trees so that it could huddle together in its own close-knit community? No, Harding told himself. That was silly. Trees didn't do such things. They didn't think or plan or organize their own lives. They simply grew. Yet, standing there beneath the branches, frightened of the shadows and apprehensive of every breath of wind that sighed through the leaves, Harding could almost bring himself to imagine a tree-like life form that grew and planned and harbored evil thoughts and watched him search and wished him ill. He bit his lip, for his mind was running amok. That way lay madness. There was no such thing as a sentient, malicious tree. Still, the existence of the tree mass seemed to tie in somewhere with the disappearance of the 3 men from the ship. His eyes grew more accustomed to the gloom. He looked around half fearfully, almost dreading whatever he might see. Would it be the bodies of his colleagues? Holding the gun ready, he turned round full circle, straining his eyes to pierce the dimness. A long way from him, away under the farther edges of the tree mass, he thought he saw a group of low heaps or mounds, some 5 or 6 in number. They looked like bodies. 3 of them could have been his friends, yet he thought it more likely that they were animals. One of the bodies suddenly got up, and Harding saw that it was a large quadruped, which began to drag itself slowly towards the outer wood. It was limping badly, and it looked in bad shape, and very shortly it had passed through the leaves and out of sight. A single bouncer followed it closely. Harding blinked, puzzled. So far he'd been too engrossed with the mystery of the scene even to remember the existence of the radio. He was overdue for calling back to the ship. Cautiously he began to walk in the direction of the remaining animals, but he never got there. "Hello?" he whispered into the transmitter. "I'm still here, in one piece. God only knows what's going on. It's uncanny. No sign of the other 3. I'm just..." That was when they got him. The first he knew of it was a faint puffing sound and a tiny crack. It wasn't much of a sound in itself, but it was enough to warn him that he was in danger. It came from above him. He looked upwards, and then he saw them. Above his head hung a half-dozen or so sack-like objects, pale green in color. He recognized them as some alien form of seed pod. They were the size of footballs, and one of them had just burst. A shower of small, winged seeds was falling swiftly towards him. The shower reached him, drifting over his head and shoulders. He realized with a shock that the seeds had sharp barbs and points on them. Somewhat foolishly, he started to count them as they stuck into his face and throat. He counted to 7 before he lost consciousness. He was out for a long, long while. When he came to, he couldn't open his eyes. He had the vague sensation that hours had passed while he lay there in the grass. His face and throat felt sore and swollen where the seeds had speared him. Dozens of them must have landed on him. Still, his eyes wouldn't open. There was a pain in his right arm, but it didn't seem to matter much. He was dazed and delirious, and he knew it. Knowing it only made it worse to bear. His arm ached terribly, but it made no difference. He was lying on his back, his eyes closed. He was hungry. Suddenly, idiotically, he felt hungry. He should have been worried about his own safety, yet his first coherent thought concerned his stomach. It was very silly. He realized that his mind was slipping. He was so damned hungry. He concentrated on thinking of food, and then he managed to open his eyes. If it hadn't been so horrible, it might have been laughable. The bouncer was eating him. At least, it was sucking his blood. There was a small piece torn out of his right arm just below the elbow. The bouncer was attached tightly to the wound, clinging on by a small round sucker mouth. The creature's fleshy body was no longer pale. With each suck, Harding saw the round body shudder as with ecstasy, then turn a frightful red as his blood filled its surface veins. Harding felt sick. He was being leeched, and he was helpless. He couldn't move. He found difficulty in thinking. So this was what had happened to the others, he decided. Yet where were their dead, or perhaps still dying bodies? Had the bouncers eaten them completely? His face stung. He tried to pull the winged seeds out of his flesh, but they wouldn't come. It wasn't any pain that prevented him pulling them out, for his facial pain seemed not quite so bad as it should have done. Perhaps the seeds held some numbing drug, he thought. Again he made an effort at pulling them out, and again he failed. He could feel little barbs sprouting in his flesh below the skin surface, stopping the seeds from leaving him. He knew that he would succeed in pulling his face off before he succeeded in removing the seeds. 3 more bouncers were watching him. They were ranged in a tiny semicircle round his feet, their eye fringes trembling. They looked as if they were waiting for something. After a while, Harding learned what it was they were waiting for. At his arm, the nearest bouncer stopped sucking. It hopped back, a ghastly scarlet in color. It stopped a yard away, watching him, and then, while Harding retched in quiet terror, one of the other bouncers took its place on his arm. It started sucking, and once again Harding passed out. This time, he felt grateful for oblivion. Eventually, he woke to half-consciousness. All 4 bouncers were watching him. They were all a sickly red color. Harding felt weak, and he wondered how much blood he'd lost. Could he make it back to the ship? Could he manage to fight off the bouncers? Could he even stand up? Yes, he could. He flexed the muscles of his legs, and after a few moments he managed to struggle to his feet. He expected the bouncers to attack him, but they simply watched him without moving. Suddenly, he remembered the radio. Then he felt sick again because the radio had broken as he fell. His gun lay nearby. Would the bouncers allow him to pick it up? Yes, they would. He picked up the gun and considered blasting every bouncer in the vicinity, but there seemed too many risks in it. For the moment, he decided he'd be quite content to get back to the ship. Revenge could come later. He covered 20 yards quickly and ducked out through the leaves, leaving the tree behind. The bouncers made no move to stop him, and their inactivity somehow disturbed him. It hinted at a terrible confidence. Outside the clearing, Harding looked back once. The bouncers were all following him, quietly, unobtrusively, at a distance. He entered the wood, and still they followed him. 10 minutes later, he had to stop and rest, for his legs felt like rubber beneath him. He leaned against a tree, suddenly noticing a strangeness about his face. He raised a tentative hand to his cheek, and then he had the most awful shock of his life. The seeds were growing. Within his flesh, they were increasing in size quickly, almost quickly enough to be felt. Each seed was like a marble, hard and terrible beneath his skin. He could also feel long tendrils that had grown from the seeds, questing and sliding down deeper into his face and throat. He was doomed, and he knew it. He shot the nearest bouncer. It exploded in a loathsome squelch of torn flesh, and Harding saw red blood pour out onto the grass. Some of it was his own. That thought made him retch again, leaning heavily against a tree. He was sweating. Suddenly, viciously, the three bouncers attacked him, fixing themselves painfully onto his ankles and shins. He smacked at them and kicked at them and ran for his life. After 50 yards, they fell away from him and left him alone. He sighed and almost smiled, and then he realized that they'd successfully managed to make him lose his gun. They learned quickly. He was alone and unarmed, in the middle of the wood, with 3 bouncers. He didn't know where the ship was. He began to limp away, stumbling and falling. He didn't know where he was going, but anywhere away from the bouncers would be ideal. No matter how swiftly he ran, they kept up with him. No matter how much he zigzagged, they stuck with him. It took him 20 minutes to accept the fact that he would never be free from them. The seeds were still growing deep inside him. He could feel hard, round shapes that pushed against his flesh from the inside. His cheeks were puffed and bleeding. He could only close his mouth halfway. One of his eyes was closed. Worst of all, 2 seed tendrils had grown back through his flesh, bursting through again towards the outside light. 2 tiny-leafed shoots hung from the wounds in the side of his throat. He knew that he couldn't go much further. He carried on through the wood until he came to the extreme edge. Here, the trees ceased and a hilly grassland took over. His biggest problem was which direction to take. Forward, left, right, or back into the wood. He was trying anxiously to make up his mind when it was painfully made up for him. The bouncers began to attack his legs again. They seemed to be acting with precision and organization, as if they had some plan. He jumped back from their savage assaults and began to run. His legs were heavy, his strides very short. The bouncers kept up with him easily, snapping at his heels now and then like dogs. Yard by yard, they forced him away from the wood, out into the grasslands, farther and farther from companionship and help. Inch by inch, they were killing him. He knew that death was very close, and all the time it was getting closer. The bouncers drove him slowly across the grassland, and then the grim significance dawned on him. It was a cold, horrible shock. The bouncers were driving him, hurting him, forcing him to go their way as would a sheepdog with its flock. They were making him go exactly where they wanted him to. He realized that he'd been lured to the tree for some particular purpose, as had his 3 colleagues. And then he'd been cunningly forced away from the tree, through the wood, out into the grassland. And still they were hurting him, snapping at his legs, driving him yard by yard towards death. So that was what the second of the missing men had meant in his final message. His message had come from the edge of the clearing in which the tree stood. "There's thousands of them in the trees. I can't get back. They won't let me." Harding noticed that the ground was rising gradually towards a darkening horizon. He knew that night was close and that he would never see morning. Somewhere in the night, death waited for him in some form or other. He would never again see the ship nor his friends, nor his home. He had to die. He wondered how death would come. Obviously, the bouncers had some objective, some alien purpose in what they were doing. They were taking him somewhere, and he knew by cold instinct that he was nearing the end of the road. The truth was as obvious as death. Even so, it hurt to admit it. A few stars were appearing in the evening sky as they reached the top of a hill. Harding looked down the gentle slope of the hill's far side, seeing a large patch of darkness against the grayness of the grasses. It looked like a wood, though it was only a very small one. The bouncers bit and sucked and savaged him with a sudden increase in fierceness and agility, causing him to stumble down the hill in a haze of pain and fear. He was drawing nearer the wood. Agony tore across his face and throat, a burning fire in which the seeds were like small, fiery rocks. All the previous numbness had worn off so that his face felt like the torn, bleeding travesty it really was. He began to cry. He fell and staggered through the twilight, closer and closer to the place where he knew he must meet death. He wanted to turn and kick at his tormentors, but there was no energy in him for fighting. All his will was spent, and there was only dark despair and a heavy sense of defeat. The wood was not a wood. He could see more clearly now that he was very close, not well enough to pick out details, yet distinctly enough to be able to see that the wood was not a wood. It was a tree, or rather a group of trees, some dozen in number. They were the same kind as the tree in the clearing. None of the trees was large. 4 or 5 10-foot saplings grew in the center, and around them Harding could see vague blurs that looked like smaller, younger trees. Harding drew even closer to the young tree mass. Then finally he was standing right in the midst of them, staring around him in horror. Night had almost fallen, yet there remained sufficient light for him to see things, and seeing, he almost went mad. He was in the middle of a charnel scene, more frightful than any nightmare. Nothing in his imagination had ever prepared him for this. Around him lay the bodies of all his 3 friends, mutilated and indescribable. He had just strength to whimper. There were also several other bodies, the putrid, horrible corpses of various native animals, all ravaged beyond belief. Harding felt himself sobbing and crying again. He knew it was a foolish and childish thing to do, and he knew that it was useless to cry, and he knew that he couldn't help himself. He glanced at the corpses again, but his throat was too torn for him to manage a scream. He could only sob. A tree grew from each body. Harding could see thick roots protruding from the dry flesh of his comrades, disappearing into the ground around them. Similarly, slender trunks stood upright from the sundered bodies of men and animals alike, clutching at the sky like demon fingers. None of the men's faces was recognizable, for most of the seeds had taken hold in the soft flesh of the cheeks and throat. Harding touched his own face, feeling long shoots springing up from fresh ruptures. The pain had all gone now. Horror was all that was left. To see his fellow men in such a state left him cold with terror. Yet to know that he himself must soon share their fate was more than he could bear. He looked wordlessly at the bouncers, all grouped close to his feet. He didn't even kick at them. He merely stared at them with icy distaste and a kind of mindless calm. There was almost a dignity in the manner in which he waited for their attack. He didn't wait long. Suddenly, they were on him, tearing at his legs until his mind rocked and the ground came up and hit him. He was down, knowing that he would never arise. The bouncers seemed to know this, too, for they left him there to die. They went away, and Harding realized that their part was played. He was alone, lying in the center of a stench and horror beyond all reason. But he knew that it was ingenious. ingenious and, in a strange alien way, logical. There were few insects and no birds on the planet, and the only winds were steady breezes that appeared rarely. Thus, the local vegetation must long ago have faced a problem, and at least one tree had come up with an adequate answer. The problem was seed dispersal, and the answer was dreadful. Harding didn't know exactly what the bouncers were. They might have been animals living in a grim symbiosis with the trees, attracting seed hosts and then driving them away to fresh ground. For this service, they would have a more or less free hand with the hosts during such time as these hosts were unconscious from the initial falling of the seeds. Or, alternatively, they might well have been entirely vegetable organisms, an integral part of the tree itself. Or again, they could have been part animal and part vegetable. He didn't know. Nor could he really care. All he knew for certain was that he was the tree's most recent victim. It had killed him. He wasn't dead yet, but it had killed him just the same. Perhaps a minute, perhaps an hour, perhaps... So this is what it is like to die, he thought, almost objectively. There was a vast curiosity about death, a great burning interest that consumed him. There was also a dim, dark fear. And the pain had come back now that he could feel death on his horizon, a tearing, damp, red pain that was slowly pulling him apart. His face was in shreds, his throat a gaping crimson hole. Long tendrils were writhing, twisting, ripping under him, over him, inside him, like bloodied, sodden snakes that slowly sipped his life away. The night washed over him, and the darkness seemed symbolic. He felt his own blood warm and prickly on his flesh. He felt rudimentary roots thrusting him from his body and plowing down, down, down into the ground. He felt pain and fear and despair. After a while, he didn't feel anything.